ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਆਪਾਂ ਗੱਲਬਾਤ ਕਰਾਂਗੇ ਵੱਖ-ਵੱਖ ਇਸ਼ੂਜ਼ ਦੇ ਉੱਤੇ ਗੱਲਬਾਤ ਕਰਾਂਗੇ ਫਾਲ ਪ੍ਰੈਕਟਿਸਿਸ ਕੀ ਹੋਣੀਆਂ ਚਾਹੀਦੀਆਂ ਆਫਟਰ ਹਾਰਵੈਸਟ ਉਸ ਦੀ ਜਿਹੜੀਆਂ ਗੱਲਾਂ ਬਾਤਾਂ ਹੋਣਗੀਆਂ ਇਸ ਤੋਂ ਇਲਾਵਾ ਬੱਗ ਡੈਮੇਜ ਨੂੰ ਲੈ ਕੇ ਵੀ ਆਪਾਂ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਉਹ ਥੋੜੀ ਬਹੁਤੀ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਚਰਚਾ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਉਹ ਕਰਾਂਗੇ Phoebe, welcome to the show once again. So we kind of have first rain of the fall. How was it?
I mean, it happened when I was asleep, but it was nice to get clear the air out a little bit. But I think we're gonna have a little while to wait before we get rains that actually, count. So.
ਓਕੇ ਸੋ ਨਾਲ ਹੀ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਸਰੋਤੇ ਦੱਸ ਜਾਈਏ ਸਾਡੇ ਅੱਜ ਦੇ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਇਸ ਪ੍ਰੋਗਰਾਮ ਆ ਉਸ ਨੂੰ ਸਪਾਂਸਰ ਕਰਦੇ ਨੇ USDA NRCS ਵਾਲੇ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦਾ ਅਸੀਂ ਬਹੁਤ ਬਹੁਤ ਧੰਨਵਾਦ ਕਰਦੇ ਹਾਂ ਇਸ ਪ੍ਰੋਗਰਾਮ ਨੂੰ ਵਿਸ਼ੇਸ਼ ਤੌਰ ਤੇ ਸਪਾਂਸਰ ਕਰਦੇ ਨੇ ਇਸ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਨਾਲ ਸਪਾਂਸਰ ਕਰਦੇ ਨੇ ਜਸਬੀਰ ਸਿੰਘ ਨਿੱਜਰ ਜੀ ਟ੍ਰੇਸੀ ਤੋਂ ਤੇ ਹਾਰਵੀ ਨਿੱਜਰ ਵਾਲੇ ਕ੍ਰੌਪ ਇੰਸ਼ੋਰੈਂਸ ਕਰਦੇ ਨੇ ਕਿਸੇ ਵੀ ਤਰੀਕੇ ਦੀ ਫਾਰਮ ਦੀ ਇੰਸ਼ੋਰੈਂਸ ਕ੍ਰੌਪ ਦੀ ਇੰਸ਼ੋਰੈਂਸ ਕਰਵਾਉਣੀ ਹੈ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਸੰਪਰਕ ਕਰੋ 5592881908 ਦੇ ਉੱਤੇ So Phoebe will be discussing about fall practices. So all are the crops being harvested or they're done?
They should be done at this point. At least the crops that I work with. Yeah, I think I remember talking to someone at Blue Diamond. There might be a couple of stragglers where something happens. But yeah, for the most part, everyone is wrapped up and is ready to get their fall practices in.
Okay, so when you say everybody's done, do you talk just about Central Valley or do you say all across California?
Well, I have most of my expertise, in the Central Valley, but at least, almonds, pistachios, that's based off of, for the most part, everyone's within a couple of weeks of each other, within the same cultivar. Depending on if one place is a little cooler, one place is a little warmer, you don't typically see really huge differences in when, almonds are pulled off. And the same with pistachios. So.
Okay. How's the crop like this time around?
I think I can tell you what I've seen from my own crack out of the almond variety trial where we're following at this point about 15 different varieties. Navel orangeworm damage is way down, but I've seen a lot of bug damage this year.
Okay.
And I've heard from other folks as well that they're seeing bug damage too.
Are those bugs new or the one which we already know?
They're the ones that we already know and hate.
Okay.
Stink bug, leaf-footed plant bug. They feed with piercing, sucking mouth parts, so they feed on the fruit. So in almonds, they can do anything from cause the fruit to fall off, depending on how early in the season they get there. And I'm kind of grouping them together. They don't always pop up at the same time, but they do similar damage. But yes, so they can cause the fruit to fall off in almonds really early in the season. A little bit later, they might just cause, really severe to less severe kernel shrivel. They damage the cells at their feeding spot, so the fruit doesn't grow as well, to anywhere from just a black spot on the fruit if it's later in the season. So pistachios, they can cause fruit drop. They can also cause stigmatomycosis. You can have the fruit, before the kernel starts to grow, just kind of shrivel up. They can also stay on that rachis as well, but they do cause crop loss of both crops.
Okay, so ਜਿੱਦਾਂ Phoebe Gordon ਦੱਸ ਰਹੇ ਆ ਵੀ ਕਹਿੰਦੇ ਵੀ ਤਕਰੀਬਨ ਸਾਰੀ ਜਗ੍ਹਾ ਹਾਰਵੈਸਟ ਹੋ ਗਈ ਹੈ ਕੁਛ ਵੀਕ ਦਾ ਹਰ ਇੱਕ ਦਾ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਡਿਫਰੈਂਸ ਰਿਹਾ ਸਾਰੀਆਂ ਜਿਹੜੀਆਂ ਕ੍ਰੌਪਸ ਦਾ ਪਰ ਇਸ ਵਾਰ ਮੈਂ ਪੁੱਛ ਰਿਹਾ ਸੀਗਾ ਵੀ ਕਿੱਦਾਂ ਦਾ ਰਿਹਾ ਆ ਕ੍ਰੌਪ ਓਵਰਆਲ ਸੋ ਕਹਿੰਦੇ ਵੀ ਕਾਫੀ ਜ਼ਿਆਦਾ ਇਸ ਵਾਰ ਬੱਗ ਡੈਮੇਜ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਉਹ ਦੇਖਣ ਨੂੰ ਮਿਲਿਆ ਸੋ ਵੱਖ-ਵੱਖ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਉਹਦੇ ਸਿੰਪਟਮ ਕਹਿ ਸਕਦੇ ਆ ਜਾਂ ਉਹਦੀਆਂ ਚੀਜ਼ਾਂ ਕਿੱਦਾਂ ਦਾ ਡੈਮੇਜ ਸੀਗਾ ਉਸ ਦੇ ਬਾਰੇ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਆਪਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਉਹ ਸ਼ੇਅਰ ਕੀਤਾ ਆ ਦੱਸਿਆ is the crop lighter or like yield wise or like there was extensive heat wave like we had a longer heat wave season so did it affect the yields?
To be honest with you, I haven't gone through and reached out to folks that I work with to see how the season was for them. Partly because I'm still trying to wrap up my own quality analysis.
Okay.
And I literally cracked out my last batch of almonds today before I came in. So we haven't done those yield calculations yet.
Okay.
But yeah, I can't really say.
Okay. By looking by the eye, do you see any difference?
Just based off of like last year, at least, we had really high levels of navel orangeworm damage. So this year, maybe the most I had in one variety was like 8%. Last year it was 25 or higher. So even if the yield is a little bit less, the quality is just going to be a lot better.
Net gain is basically at the same level or better. So which is good. So farmers were in a pickle last season, the start of this season, like because of a lot of financial constraints. This did it affect the season overall? Did you see what were the farmers talking to you about that?
So I think this year, in my experience, last year I talked to some folks that were cutting back in some areas. I think we saw that partly in what we saw with the navel orangeworm damage. Folks are trying to save money on not sanitizing. So I think that's, there are several reasons why navel orangeworm damage was so bad last year, but I think this year more folks did sanitize. There were also folks last year that I think tried to cut back on sprays. We had a much wetter winter last year than we did this year, but still I didn't get nearly as many disease calls this year. So I think that, I think it's hard to say because, I think, from what I've heard, people's payout last year is what they're dealing with this year. So people still have, the money is tight this year as well. But I think, it just, in my experience, when people saw the sort of like damage they got from, not doing those bloom time sprays for almonds, I think they're much more inclined to put those sprays on this year.
Okay, so well, hopefully things turn out better for everyone around that. So when you say you got less calls, so this is better that less disease. You see less disease pressure overall.
Yeah, I think so. Last year was just such a unique year. We got, just an insane amount of rain. And so I saw a lot of Phytophthora last year, aerial Phytophthora in almonds, as well as some, flood related damage last year. And I just didn't see that as much this year. I should say this spring, because we had, more typical rainfall. Yeah, I mean, I did see some botrytis in pistachios. We had a cool, wet time period that coincided with when the pistachios leafed out, started to grow and bloomed. So I did have an interesting cluster of farm calls that were, all botrytis related due to that. But I just didn't get as many disease calls this year as I did last year.
Okay, so I've seen the Fresno Irrigation District. They've already stopped the water in the canals. So this is different from last year. Last year, the water was still flowing even after the end of the season as well. What's different this year? So is the snowfall was less last year?
Yeah, we got less snowfall. So the 2022 to 2023, winter. So what we were going into the 2023 growing season with, we got the snowiest year on record. I think we got, man, I'd have to look back. If I'm remembering correctly, we got closer to average this year, maybe a little above average, but don't quote me on that. So yeah, it's just people had more water than they knew what to do with last year, whereas this year I think it's a little bit more what folks are typically used to dealing with, aside from it being a dry year. But I can't speak to everybody. I wouldn't. So I guess that might make it, if you're trying to get on a late season irrigation for starting a cover crop, or maybe to try to at least get some of that gypsum in, that might be a little bit of an issue.
Okay, so let's talk about the fall practices as well. So once the harvest is done, so what are the things need to be done on the farm now?
So one really good thing to do, if you haven't gotten a soil sample in this year, do your soil sampling. So soil sampling is really great for managing salinity. Um, you're adding salts into your soil with your irrigation water. Even if you have really pure, canal water that came from snow melt, it still contains some salts. So it will build up over time, especially if you don't have a leaching program in place. And so it's always a good idea to know what you're dealing with. I would say at the very minimum, soil sample every other year. But I think it's just a good practice to sample every year. And so, if you don't really have to deal with salinity that much, it's just a good idea to have that record. But if you do, you also need to sample so you can calculate how much gypsum to apply to your site to do winter leaching.
Okay, so so other than that, like gypsum, so what's the best time? Is it the prime time right now to apply it?
Yeah, I think so for salinity management.
Mm-hmm.
So when you get that soil sample, you'll get if you have a salinity issue, you should ask for a salinity test. It's going to give you the amount of sodium that you have in your soil based off of milliequivalents per liter instead of parts per million, which is what your general salinity test will do. So they're both concentrations, but the implications are a little different. And the calculations for leaching are based off of the milliequivalents per liter. So it's really good to put down gypsum at this time of the year because the rain can do two things.
Mm-hmm.
One, it helps to dissolve it and push it into the soil, depending on how you apply it. But leaching sodium from your soil, the gypsum's good for sodium. Just water will remove chlorides. And we can get into that next. But you need to have water to move everything from the root zone.
Mm-hmm.
Just applying gypsum isn't going to do anything. So rainwater is really pure. It's free. So I will say in a year where almond prices weren't bad, I would say gypsum isn't that expensive.
Mm-hmm.
And so you're not going to harm your orchard by applying it. And, even if we don't get enough rain to push it from the root zone. And it can provide some benefits during the growing season as well. But yeah, so you get that free water falling from the sky, and the leaching requirements are lower too because the trees aren't losing water. So you don't have to worry about accounting for that as well as applying the extra water you need to leach salts from the root zone.
Okay. Is there a particular amount what one should be applying per acre?
That depends on that salinity test. So in general, what we say is you need about 1 ton of gypsum to get rid of 1 milliequivalent per liter of sodium from a 6-inch slice of soil.
Okay.
So you'll be doing those calculations based off of the salinity that you have, the salinity that you want, what the salinity of your irrigation water is, you need those 3 things to calculate a leaching fraction. So it's math. So
Okay.
radio is not the ideal format to talk about that, but that's the general rule of thumb is
Okay.
that's how much gypsum.
So when you say the salinity test, like what level, at what depth of the soil one should be doing, or should it be done at different levels?
So I would say if you are just doing a yearly sampling, just keeping an eye on your orchard, what you do for your regular fertility test is fine. You can sample that top foot of soil. It will give you other information as well, like potassium, maybe pH, that sort of thing. You want to make sure you're sampling about half of the wetted radius. So you have that center point, go halfway out and sample in that area. Scrape off maybe the top centimeter or so, half an inch of soil. Especially if you surface apply a lot of stuff, because that's going to get mixed in. It's not going to give you a good picture of what your soil actually looks like. If you have a bigger salinity problem, you do want to go deeper because you want to see how deep those salts are distributed. A lot of salinity is actually very shallow, but depending on how severe the problem is and how long it's been going on, especially, pistachios are a more salt tolerant crop. They might be planted in more salt affected soils, and you might be using saltier water. So, I would say go down to 3 or 4, maybe 5 feet, that effective rooting zone, to try to figure out how much of a salinity problem you have.
Okay. So other than gypsum, what else need to be done? What other practices one should be doing? Like, so the first thing is gypsum, then what?
You can think about applying potassium if you want. The traditional way of applying potassium was to surface apply it to the soil, and the winter rains would do the same thing. It would dissolve it, move it a little bit into the soil.
Okay.
Not everyone does that these days because with the price of gas and labor, it can actually be cheaper to run it through the irrigation system.
Okay.
But I have talked to folks where that's how they apply their potassium. That's how they like to do it. They've done it on a regular basis, and their trees, are perfectly sufficient in potassium. But yeah, we have different products. We have really good irrigation systems that were developed long after these initial fall application of potassium standards were developed. People have been doing that for decades and decades. Our really good irrigation systems are a much more modern phenomenon. So yeah, you can do either, but a fall application of potassium is still a good practice. Just make sure it lands in that wetted zone because that's where the roots are during the growing season.
Okay. And irrigation wise, like before the rain starts, what's the advice? How much you need to irrigate before the dormancy starts before the trees go dormant?
Well, I would say follow evapotranspiration. As the days are shorter and the temperatures drop a lot, the actual water demand of trees is pretty low.
Very low.
And so I just follow what the ET standards say. I will say for both almonds and pistachios, let's say you're not getting the surface water or the canal water delivered to you. You're not sure if you want to, be paying those pumping fees. I don't think there's going to be a huge amount of damage done to the trees if you don't continue to irrigate until leaves fall off. Especially, it's just they might be a little stressed, but if the soil was pretty wet before you decided to turn the water off, there's probably a decent amount of water in that root zone that can supply those trees' demands.
Okay. Is it cold enough that the trees will go dormant, or because that's what kind of talk too, like it's not getting cold enough?
I don't know the answer to that question because we actually still don't know when trees truly go dormant.
Okay.
That's dormancy is I was on a research project with Greet Brar, at Fresno State, where he called it a black box, and that's still very true. We understand more than we used to, but when that starting point for when we start counting those chill portions is still kind of squishy. I would say, that definition of dormancy where you take a plant and you put it in good conditions and see if it starts growing. I would guess that if you tried to do that with pistachios, it probably wouldn't happen at this point, but I might be wrong. I would say when the leaves fall off the tree, they're definitely dormant. But there's more signals that the trees are getting too, aside from just temperature. They also how long days are and particularly how long nights are also signals that plants receive that help them. I wouldn't decide is not the correct term, but they also use that to decide when to move into dormancy as well.
Okay. If the leaves are falling, then definitely they're moving towards that.
Yeah. So we're kind of in that time frame right now where it's
Twilight zone, huh?
Yeah. I think the official start date for counting chill portions, official is in air quotes here, is November 15th. So we're not quite there yet, but I mean, the days are very short now, so things are still probably happening at this point internally that the trees are, in that path to dormancy if they're not already there.
Okay. Well, hopefully they need some rest too.
Yeah, they do. They do.
Yeah. So potassium, gypsum. Once those are done, the rain's gonna be here. It's gonna be pretty wet. It's gonna be hard to get into the farms as well. So, what are the other things farmers can do right now?
Well, it's not too early to start sanitizing. It's the foundation of control for navel orangeworm because, those larvae are in the almonds and pistachios. That's where they overwinter. And so if you destroy those nuts, you're destroying those larvae and you're also destroying food sources for them early in the season. For the new Carpophilus beetle, the only thing that has been really shown to consistently work, from the 10 years or so the Australians have been dealing with it, is sanitation as well. For Carpophilus beetle, it's really important that you make sure those nuts are destroyed. I've heard folks suggest that instead of doing one pass, you do 2 passes to make sure that's the case. So yeah, as early as possible to go in and do those sanitation shakes is a good idea. We do suggest that you wait until we receive that first rain, which, has already happened. A good foggy day too, so that those nuts absorb some water and they're a little bit heavier and easier to shake from the tree.
So mummy shake should happen then?
Yeah, you can wait till then. It's hard because, shaking, it is stress and damage to the tree. So you can do, folks can go out, do a test shake, if they have their own equipment, see if mummies are falling. If so, maybe, keep on going through. If it seems like they're not, maybe wait until that first rain. So yeah, it's hard because, if the rain starts and then doesn't stop, then you have a hard time getting in. But, if we have a good, 1/4 inch to a 1/2 inch rain event, and then it's pretty dry afterwards, that's a good time to get into the orchard to sanitize.
Okay. So yeah, definitely ਇਹ ਸਾਰੀਆਂ ਚੀਜ਼ਾਂ ਜਿਹੜੀਆਂ ਉਹ ਕਰਨ ਦੀ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਜ਼ਰੂਰਤ ਹੈ, ਜਿੱਦਾਂ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਕਿਹਾ ਵੀ ਜਿਪਸਮ ਤੇ ਪੋਟੈਸ਼ੀਅਮ ਪਾਉਣ ਦਾ ਇਹ ਸਹੀ ਵਕਤ ਹੈਗਾ ਆ। ਡੋਰਮੈਂਟ ਹੋ ਰਹੇ ਆ ਕਿ ਨਹੀਂ, ਕੋਲਡ ਕਿੰਨਾ ਕੁ ਕਿ ਨਹੀਂ, ਉਹਦੇ ਬਾਰੇ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਅੱਜ ਕਹਿੰਦੇ ਵੀ ਪੱਕਾ ਤਸਦੀਕ ਨਾਲ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਉਹ ਨਹੀਂ ਦੱਸਿਆ ਜਾ ਸਕਦਾ। ਪਰ 15 ਨਵੰਬਰ ਦੱਸ ਰਹੇ ਸੀ, ਉਸ ਤੋਂ ਬਾਅਦ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਜਿਹੜੀਆਂ ਚਿਲ ਡੇਜ਼ ਜਾਂ ਠੰਡ ਕਿੰਨੀ ਕੁ, ਉਸ ਹਿਸਾਬ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਉਹ ਦੇਖਿਆ ਜਾਂਦਾ ਆ। ਗੱਲਾਂ ਬਾਤਾਂ ਆਪਾਂ ਜਿਹੜੀਆਂ ਉਹ ਇੱਦਾਂ ਹੀ ਜਾਰੀ ਰੱਖਾਂਗੇ। ਇੱਕ ਆਪਾਂ ਹੁਣ ਬ੍ਰੇਕ ਲਵਾਂਗੇ ਤੇ ਬ੍ਰੇਕ ਤੋਂ ਬਾਅਦ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਆਪਾਂ ਮੁੜਦੇ ਹਾਂ ਵਾਪਸ, ਤੇ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਪ੍ਰੋਗਰਾਮ ਅਪਡੇਟ ਫਾਰਮਿੰਗ ਆ ਉਹ ਇਸੇ ਤਰੀਕੇ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਚੱਲਦਾ ਰਹੇਗਾ। ब्रेक तो बाद एक फिर आप सब ਦਾ ਸਵਾਗਤ ਹੈ ਸੋ ਤੇ ਪ੍ਰੋਗਰਾਮ ਚੱਲ ਰਿਹਾ ਜੀ ਅਪਡੇਟ ਫਾਰਮਿੰਗ ਮੈਂ ਰਾਜਕਨਵੀਰ ਸਿੰਘ ਮੇਰੇ ਨਾਲ ਸਟੂਡੀਓ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਜੁੜੇ ਹੋਏ ਨੇ ਫੀਬੀ ਗਾਰਡਨ ਫੀਬੀ welcome back to the show. So we were talking about the fall practices which we need to do. Uh, is this a misconception or is this recommended that you put some nitrogen in after the harvest?
I think it used to be that we would recommend that. We don't anymore. Now that there's been quite a few research projects that look at when trees are taking up nitrogen. It's a little harder to say with almonds, but for pistachios, it consistently shows that they just don't really take up nitrogen after harvest. The demand for nitrogen in any bearing nut crop is basically the fruit is what's driving that. And so, once that fruit development is done, the trees are basically done with that, and they just, they're doing other things, photosynthesizing, storing sugars for the next year. But it's pretty consistent that there's no nitrogen uptake after harvest. For almonds, it's a little harder to say because, you can be harvesting as very early as, maybe late July if you're down in Kern County with a really early harvesting variety all the way through, October. So if you have a really heavy demand or a really heavy crop in an early harvesting variety, maybe a post-harvest nitrogen application is a good idea in that case. And we have early season prediction tests that you can do about 40 days after bloom for both almonds and pistachios. It'll predict whether or not your trees are going to be deficient in July. And so it'll help you adjust within season. So hopefully you don't even have to get to that point too. But yeah, if you have a nitrogen uptake happens, when water uptake is happening. And so if the trees are really stressed, the leaves are already falling, sometimes it happens if it's a hot year, people hold back or cut back on water for a little too long. There's just not much nitrogen uptake that's going to be happening at that point. So, so we just don't suggest that anymore.
Okay. So you guys have changed your mind on that, huh? Yeah. Okay.
It happens.
It happens. Yeah. Well, the research shows that.
Yeah.
Is there anything else other than nitrogen? Like people usually put cover crops by now. So if still somebody's a little late to that, is it good time still to do it?
I think you could. I'm not an expert in cover crops, but we still have some pretty nice warm days. The soil is warm still, so you probably could get some good germination. Although, depending on if you're waiting on that rain, that definitely hasn't happened yet, so you could definitely plant there. But if you're trying to get really good growth, I think most folks recommend October. You could also just let, the weeds, the resident winter vegetation grow. That will help save you money because you're not applying pre-emergent herbicides there. You still want to keep that tree row clean, but you can, instead of applying across the entire orchard floor, which less and less people are doing that these days, you can let those weeds grow. They still provide a lot of the same benefits.
Okay.
Those roots are in the soil, breaking things up, creating channels for water to move in. They're adding carbon to the soil. Depending on what's growing there, you might have a lot of filiary that has flowers. Bees are going to be visiting that too. And so I would also say one thing someone could consider doing too is if you have a really narrow vegetation strip, you can try widening it a little bit, maybe turning one of those nozzles off to just increase the width of that strip, and you're applying less pre-emergent herbicides. Those weeds are growing in more of the orchard floor and doing, what those weeds do.
Okay. Okay. Well, that's something we need to do. And how about irrigation system maintenance? Is this a good time?
I think so. There's always the risk that, you can go in and go fix everything up, and then you have some rodents over the wintertime coming and chewing things up. But, getting those lines flushed, maybe if you haven't flushed your filters, doing that too. going in and making sure, maybe if someone did a quick fix on a leak during the summertime, going in and doing something, that's a little bit more permanent. Maybe replacing a line if it's been chewed on a lot. This is a good time of the year to do that too.
Okay. We'll circle back to bug damage now. As you mentioned in the starting of the program, that you have seen more bug damage this year, stink bug and leaf-footed bug. So, what are the things can be done right now to avoid it for the next season?
So part of the problem that these bugs seem to have become more of a problem when folks move to more targeted insecticides to control navel orangeworm, because these bugs used to not really be considered much of a problem. So we don't have, unfortunately, really good, economic thresholds where, you find X number of bugs and that means you need to spray. In general, we say that you need to protect the crop. So I would say this time of the year, there probably isn't a whole lot to do. You could definitely scout. Green stink bugs will overwinter in orchards, so you could see at least if they're there. So I think, we had, a lot of bug damage this year because we had 2 pretty wet winters in a row. These bugs will feed on other plants. They don't just feed on almonds and pistachios. And so there's a lot of forage for them to eat, build up in populations, and then move into the orchard and cause damage. I would say if you had a lot of bug damage, and this isn't uncommon that folks will say I don't really scout for them, I don't really have them, then they get hit one year and then they start, controlling more, is to get ready to do that sampling next year. So if you have almonds, leaf-footed bug damage can start in March. If you have pistachios, both leaf-footed bug and stink bug is a little later in April. Get familiar with what the damage looks like. So in almonds, they can be gumming on the fruit. In pistachios, it's little black shriveled up fruit early in the season or black spots. You'll get a little bit of gum with pistachios as well. So just get familiar with what that damage looks like and get ready to start scouting or have your PCA scout next spring.
Okay. Scouting is one of the best things that could be done.
Yeah, it's just we don't have economic threshold data. When you spray is what you're comfortable with. So what we say is if you have damage and you're finding, insects that are feeding, that's when you spray. Just be looking for the damage. If possible, look for the insects as well. Leaf-footed plant bug, it can be hard because the adults are very mobile, so they'll fly away. Stink bugs, I think, in my personal experience, they're a little less mobile. I've grabbed them off of trees plenty of times,
Okay.
They don't move, in my experience, that far from the scene of the crime. But yeah, those leaf-footed plant bugs can be hard to pin down. But maybe trying to look for adults that are flying away if you're starting to see damage early in the season, it can be an indicator that they're in there and they're causing damage.
Okay. These are the things which we need to take care in this fall. So salinity management, gypsum, potassium, irrigation system, flushing, maintaining it, bug damage, nitrogen. So all these kind of things needs to be done. This year, it's not going to be that wet winter like as we have seen for the past 2 seasons. So what is something from the irrigation point of view farmers can do or think about to do for the next season?
Well, we don't know yet. I think.
Well, we know what it's looking at.
We thought that in 2022 to 2023, though, we were going to have another drought year, and then we were slammed with water starting in January, or I think just late December, and it didn't stop. So, I have. For my podcast, Growing the Valley, I try to have an annual water outlook, and the person that I interview every year will not talk to me before January. So,
okay. So we
I tried to pin him down earlier. I think it's a little too early. But I think if you can, filling up the soil profile with water probably isn't a bad idea. When to pull that trigger, I would probably say maybe, in my opinion, January. You don't want to do it too early because, especially if you're pumping groundwater, you're paying those electricity costs, and that can be very expensive. But having water to start the season out with and to pull upon when it gets a little stressful or hot, maybe you can't get that water on fast enough. It's always a good idea to have that deep reservoir. And trying to irrigate really deeply, unless you have a really sandy soil, it's really hard to do it during the growing season. We say manage the top 2 to 3 feet of soil for irrigation during the growing season. So that winter time is probably the only time you can really try to get water down that deep. Of course, that's easier said than done if you have a clay versus a sandy soil.
Sandy soil.
Yeah. So it's not a bad idea. But maybe wait to see how much rain we get to see if it's needed. And how deep to go. The effective rooting zone for almonds is 5 feet. We don't 100% know for pistachios, although we do know that they can root down deeper. I'm not saying try to push down water 10 feet down, but maybe trying to get water down to 4 to 5 feet isn't a bad idea.
Is it supposed to be El Nino or La Nina this year?
I don't think they formally made that
prediction yet,
but I think what it's looking like is La Nina.
La Nina is drier.
Yeah, although it's supposed to be drier, a little cooler during the winter time. Although I know, I am not at all an expert on this, but from what I understand, that kind of, it stacks the deck, but it doesn't 100% predict what the winter is going to look like. So
it's always a prediction.
Yeah, it's true. It's true.
Well, I have few citruses at home. They haven't turned yellow, so it tells me it's not that cold yet.
It's not cold. Yeah. Hopefully it'll get to that point.
Yeah. So ਜਿੰਨੇ ਵੀ ਸਾਡੇ ਸੁਣਨ ਵਾਲੇ ਆ ਸੋ ਦੇਖ ਰਹੇ ਨਾ ਵੀ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਸੰਤਰੇ ਅਜੇ ਤੱਕ ਪੀਲੇ ਵਗੈਰਾ ਨਹੀਂ ਹੋਏ ਤਾਂ ਜੇ ਸਿਆਲਾਂ ਦੇ ਨਾਲੋਂ ਜ਼ਿਆਦਾ ਪੀਲੇ ਹੁੰਦੇ ਆ ਸੋ ਅਜੇ ਪੂਰੀ ਤਰ੍ਹਾਂ ਸਿਆਲ ਨਹੀਂ ਆਏ ਸੋ ਹੋ ਸਕਦਾ ਵੀ ਇਸ ਵਾਰ ਆਪਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਉਸ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਥੋੜਾ ਲੇਟ ਥੋੜਾ ਡਿਲੇ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਉਹ ਦੇਖਣ ਨੂੰ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਉਹ ਮਿਲੇ ਸੋ ਲੈਟਸ ਸੀ ਕੀ ਇਸ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਪਾਉਂਦਾ ਆ ਸੋ Phoebe, thank you very much. Today at the end of the show, today is an election day as well, and anybody who is a citizen, who is a registered voter, I would highly encourage everybody to go and vote who hasn't voted yet. Have you voted?
I did, yeah. I voted absentee already.
You already voted. So thank you very much. So thank you for today, and see you next time around. So ਬਹੁਤ ਧੰਨਵਾਦ ਸਾਰਿਆਂ ਦਾ ਸੋ ਅਪਡੇਟ ਫਾਰਮਿੰਗ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਆਪਾਂ ਗੱਲਬਾਤ ਕਰ ਰਹੇ ਸੀਗੇ Phoebe Gordon ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਸੋ ਜਿਨ੍ਹਾਂ ਨੇ ਫਾਲ ਪ੍ਰੈਕਟਿਸਿਸ ਦੇ ਬਾਰੇ ਗੱਲ ਕੀਤੀ ਨਾਈਟ੍ਰੋਜਨ ਦੀ ਵੀ ਗੱਲ ਕੀਤੀ ਕਹਿੰਦੇ ਲੋੜ ਨਹੀਂ ਹੁੰਦੀ ਪਹਿਲਾਂ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਦੀ ਚਾਹੇ ਯੂਨੀਵਰਸਿਟੀਆਂ ਕਹਿੰਦੀਆਂ ਸੀਗੀਆਂ ਪਰ ਹੁਣ ਜਿਹੜੀਆਂ ਉਹ ਨਹੀਂ ਕਹਿੰਦੀਆਂ ਸੋ ਇਸ ਤਰੀਕੇ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਉਹ ਦੱਸ ਰਹੇ ਨੇ ਵੀ ਭਾਈ ਹੁਣ ਨਾਈਟ੍ਰੋਜਨ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਉਹ ਪਾਉਣ ਦੀ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਉਹ ਜ਼ਰੂਰਤ ਨਹੀਂ ਹੁੰਦੀ ਖਾਸ ਕਰਕੇ ਹਾਰਵੈਸਟ ਤੋਂ ਬਾਅਦ 'ਚ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਆਪਾਂ ਗੱਲ ਕਰ ਰਹੇ ਉੱਦਾਂ ਜਦੋਂ ਪਾਉਣੀ ਹੈ ਉਹ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਜ਼ਰੂਰ ਪਾਓ ਪੋਟੈਸ਼ੀਅਮ ਜਿਪਸਮ ਨਾਈਟ੍ਰੋਜਨ ਬਗ ਡੈਮੇਜ ਵੀ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਇਸ ਵਾਰ ਜ਼ਿਆਦਾ ਦੇਖਣ ਨੂੰ ਮਿਲਿਆ ਆ ਸਕਾਊਟਿੰਗ ਵਗੈਰਾ ਕਰਕੇ ਕਹਿੰਦੇ ਵੀ ਦੇਖੋ ਇਰੀਗੇਸ਼ਨ ਸਿਸਟਮ ਆ ਉਸ ਨੂੰ ਆਪਣਾ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਚੰਗੀ ਤਰ੍ਹਾਂ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਉਹ ਸੈੱਟ ਕਰ ਲਓ ਹੁਣ ਤੁਹਾਡੇ ਕੋਲ ਇਹ ਮੌਕਾ ਹੈਗਾ ਆ ਤੇ ਵਧੀਆ ਮੀਂਹ ਦੀ ਆਸ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਮਿਲਦੇ ਹਾਂ ਜੀ ਫਿਰ ਆਪਾਂ ਹੁਣ ਅਗਲੀ ਵਾਰ ਸਭ ਨੂੰ ਪਿਆਰ ਭਰੀ ਸਤਿ ਸ਼੍ਰੀ ਅਕਾਲ ਥੈਂਕ ਯੂ